Dear professors and colleagues, welcome to our session. I hope you will be enjoying it. I will be talking about shame as an affective ideology in Great Expectations. As you know, there has been a shift of focus from guilt to shame in the scholarship of Dickens's Great Expectations from the second half of the 20th century onwards. And the recent affective turn in cultural and literary theory has contributed to this shift tremendously. And in the novel, I analyzed two trajectories of affective shame, which I will be calling symptomatic shame and symptomatic shame. I am borrowing these terms from Lacanian psychoanalysis. I will be briefly explaining them because they are very useful to analyze the variations between shame, the effect of shame. And I argue that the co-presence of these affective states in the novel presents Pip's building as obstructed and thus problematize bourgeois ideology constructed upon autonomous agency from within. I brought up a few questions. If bourgeois subjectivity is built on autonomous self-controlling agency, then what is the function of a protagonist with masochistic tendencies in a Victorian Bildungsroman? Or can we build a relationship between Pip's psychic masochism and affective shame in the novel? And thirdly, I ask the question, do affects have the potential to be ideological and counter-ideological simultaneously? These questions are very significant to show how the myth of autonomous agency is deconstructed from within, deconstructed in the narrative from within. So reconsidering the ethical preoccupations of the novel built around the gentlemanly ideal, I argue that a protagonist with masochistic tendencies can both serve and negate bourgeois morality that epistemologically relies on self-made and self-controlling individuals. Towards the end of the narrative, Pip says, quote, "I confounded impossible existences with my own identity," unquote. These impossible existences refer to the moments Pip loses touch with his real or material conditions of being under the influence of the gentlemanly ideal. To give a very brief summary, Pip, as an orphan raised by his sister, is a morally sensitive protagonist filled with various forms of shame that cause him to be manipulated by most of the characters in the novel. So despite feeling humiliation and despair in the hands of his sister, he continues to feel the same with Estella, his lover. Pip falls in love with her and desires to be united with her despite all the suffering she causes him. And this masochistic desire leads him to embrace the gentlemanly ideal and contemplate Miss Havisham as his benefactor. By masochism here, I refer to Deleuze's own definition, which is based on the feeling of displeasure before pleasure, and Pip's tendency to experience displeasure as a precondition for pleasure in both his relationship with Estella and the gentlemanly ideal indicates that Pip's shame is actually his symptom. His class shame is his symptom of a symptom of masochism in the narrative. And symptom, if we define symptom, it is the way in which each subject enjoys the unconscious insofar as the unconscious determines him. In the narrative, Pip's class shame is the manifestation of his affective becoming within bourgeois ideology. And the relationship between masochism and shame is very significant for this narrative. And it could be, although the studies on masochism and shame are separate, I believe that they should really be connected, to be brought together in order to give a complete, at least struggle to give the attempt, or my attempt to give a complete picture of Pip's agency. And this relationship between masochism and shame could be formulated on the ground that masochism in the novel incorporates the inward suffering within the historical and cultural context of the gentlemanly shame. Gentlemanly shame involves a moral sensibility tied to the condition of social class in the Victorian period. While shame is thought to be a private, personal experience, it's turned into a public affect, indicating culture's role in internalizing shame in order to be a gentleman. And now the middle class conception of gentleman includes a moral sensibility, in contrast to be born with wealth, to be gentleman by blood. And so this is a disciplinary project saturated with a collective significance, aiming to bridge the gap between the social classes, as we will see in the case of Pip's and Joe's affective reconnection. Yet I argue that in the novel, this project is undermined from within. Mrs. Joe's, if we look at the narrative closely to give a few specific examples, Mrs. Joe's upbringing, Pip, by a hard and heavy hand under the disciplinary power of a tickler, leaves a traumatic influence on Pip as an orphan, and this unconsciously leads him to repeat the exact circumstances of the trauma with Estella. Pip says, quote, "All my punishments, disgraces, fasts and vigils and other penitential performances made me morally timid and very sensitive," unquote. Pip repeats this trauma with Estella. In Deleuze's account of masochism, fetishism or fantasy and a contractual relationship occupy the center of the love relationship between the male masochist and his torturer. So, and also the interrupted love is an important feature of masochism, and it becomes the reproductive mechanism behind Pip's Bildung. So Pip's fetishism of the gentlemanly ideal under his fantasy of having signed a contract with Miss Havisham as his benefactor renders him the Deleuzean masochistic subject. This subject questions the validity of existing reality in order to create a pure ideal reality. So Pip actually, Pip's consideration of Miss Havisham, assumption that Miss Havisham is his benefactor without any solid evidence, indicates his desire to create a pure ideal reality. Despite all the disgrace and humiliation he suffers because of Estella, Pip says that, quote, "I loved her against reason, against promise, against peace, against hope, against happiness, against all discouragements that could be," unquote. So although he feels the displeasure at the maximum level, in his relationship with Estella, Pip desires to go through all this pleasure, and in order to become a gentleman on her own account, on Estella's account, and to be united with her. But this is the contractual relationship that is refers to, and the bodily and psychic integration of affective shame is most clearly observed in Pip's hysteric crying, as you might remember. It's beyond his control after he's made to feel ashamed of his coarse hands and coarse boots. It becomes, this crying gets out of his control. And his crying out of symptomatic shame emphasizes precognitive nature of affects. Although he says that he was ashamed, it's the adult narrator's voice. So the body of Pip, the focalizer, speaks his unconscious affects rather than conscious recognition of it at the time. And crying, therefore, appears as Pip's major bodily affective response in the novel, located at the major scenes marking his identity. So the class shame made him cry and desire Estella. His class shame is thus offered as a willful suffering for Pip to be recognized. This is very significant because Pip's forging his way through the social status-based gentlemanly ideal lays bare how symptomatic shame or class shame turns into a cultural form of affect or affective ideology in CNI's terms that can promise recognition by society. And Pip's feeling ashamed of Joe prepares the way for his public shame. He says that when Joe wants to visit him in London, Pip says, quote, "Presently I heard Joe on the staircase. I knew it was Joe by his clumsy manner of coming upstairs, his state boots being always too big for him," unquote. So Pip's awareness of Joe's class is immediate and embodied, as the critic Audrey Jeff emphasizes in her article on social class as affect on her reading of social class as an affective experience in relation to Dickens's novels. Joe's so-called clumsy manner during the entire encounter between them reveals their interpersonal relationship as a perverse form of affective connection through class shame. Pip's symptomatic shame determines the affective disconnection between Pip and Joe, and this is to be recuperated with the moral shame, with symptomatic shame. So his reconnection to reality, to his class, and to Joe are all codependent. Pip's feeling morally ashamed of his class shame defines Pip's process of acculturation. I call this a symptomatic affect because symptom allows the subject, either a masochist or a psychotic, to cohere, to reconnect to the external world in a new way, in a way that will enable the subject to live, to survive. In the narrative, bourgeois morality requires Pip to identify with the symptom, the ideal of gentleman rather than gentleman, through his shame. By moving from symptomatic shame to symptomatic shame, Pip manages to fulfill the requirements of the Bildungsroman that imagines the necessity of the narrator as a moral guide. So the first variation, the symptomatic shame, triggers Pip's imaginative access as a masochist willing to suffer. It overwhelms him with intractability about the gentleman ideal and increases class division. Therefore, the second variation, which is defined as symptomatic shame, is supposed to act like an internal regulator to link him to his new material conditions of being and to the social as a gentleman capable of overcoming class divisions. However, this shame, I argue, obstructs Pip's agency further, enables an illusionary connection to his former class members, and thus discloses the form of existence that bourgeois morality offers to its members as another impossible existence. Pip's symptomatic shame thus indicates how affect plays into the ideology, defining culture as a distance from the impulsive or instinctive, as the critic Audrey Jeff argues. This is actually her emphasis. Culture means a distance from the impulsive or instinctive, and shame, moral shame, works to that function. To explain that further, it should be noted that neither Joe's gentility nor Orlick's sadism, both from the working class, is suitable for the mid-century gentlemanly ideal. It is Pip's ontological becoming, a traumatic ontological becoming, that is acted upon to go through an affective structuration of ideological contradictions on the class issue. Pip's symptomatic crying in Stella's presence modulates into protracted symptomatic crying for his ingratitude towards Joe, promising to bridge class barriers by triggering their affective reconnection. Yet the nature of this reconnection is open to discussion. To be a truly moral gentleman in Victorian society requires one's disconnection from his self and his society by experiencing both variations of affective shame in order to become the so-called self-made individual, which is also the paradox of liberal humanism. Pip is as free as he allows his agency to be obstructed. This paradox is a dilemma charged with political meaning in CN9's words, called charged with a political meaning, regardless of whether the obstruction is actual or fantasized, or whether the agency obstructed is individual or collective, unquote. To put it simply, negative affects such as shame can reveal the conditions of an obstructed agency based on one's interpersonal relationship with other subjects or the society. This obstruction can be either actual or fantasized, and this agency can be either an individual or collective agency. Pip's embodiment of the genuine ideal of gentleman is supposed to reconnect him to Joe. However, the implied author allows his reconnection to Joe and Biddy only through letters for years, until he establishes himself as a middle-class man. The second ending of the novel, replacing the original one, starts with Pip's sentence, quote, "For 11 years, I had not seen Joe nor Biddy with my bodily eyes," unquote. Pip's emigration to Egypt to resolve ideological contradictions, along with his close bodily acquaintance with the middle-class gentleman Herbert and his wife, lays bare that even the quasi-democratic middle-class form of the gentlemanly ideal is equated with economic and social distinction more than moral attributes. Pip's symptomatic shame obstructs his individual agency by driving him into a false consciousness about the ideal of self-made gentleman. All in all, while shame as an affective ideology in nice terms projects itself in the form of a value system by transforming self-destructive tendencies into virtues, it also reveals the existence of a false struggle for class inequalities of the time. Symptomatic shame in the novel implies that there is transposition from the vice of snobbery to the virtue of elitism, and it is enabled at the expense of a restricted or commodified agency. Thank you very much for listening to me. I have enjoyed writing this paper, and it has been really, really long. I tried to shorten it as much as I can, but I would be very happy to receive all kinds of questions. Thank you so much for listening to me. I wish you a great day with lots of nice papers. Thank you.